All right, we're going to get a little bit technical again. So we're switching it up. We're going from the touchy-feely. I feel like I should be standing like this. That's all right. Steve Fulton's the Vice President, Sales and Marketing of Sandel, and we're going to talk a little bit about NextGen and the NextGen environment. I know from recent experience, we've just done some avionics work to one of our 604s. I cannot keep this kind of stuff straight, timelines and what these black boxes do anymore. I've been assured that there is not one single photograph in this presentation of avionics, so that will tell you what Steve is going to actually talk about. It's more the environment. So, Steve, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Everybody hear me okay? So, as Al said, this presentation doesn't have any pictures of avionics in it. It's a talk on NextGen Avionics, but nothing about avionics that you can tell. My objective with this talk is to provide you a little context of what's happening with the airspace. There's some significant upgrades underway right now in the United States. It's all under this banner called NextGen. And so as opportunities or requirements come to you in your work where you have to make decisions about equipment that you put in the airplane, hopefully this will provide some context and some perspective on really what is the objective, what's the operational capability that you're trying to achieve. I had the good fortune or misfortune, I don't know what it was, but to come in halfway through Bill's talk, and I wasn't able to see his face. I was standing back over here, so I was trying to take notes, Bill. I don't know if I'm going to get all this right or not, but it's like, slow down, Professor. I was taking notes as fast as I could, but so nothing like coming behind a presentation coach with your own presentation. So. All right, so just a big picture. What are we doing with NextGen? What is the objective? And to understand that, maybe a good place to start is, well, where have we come from? So air traffic management or air traffic control started way back with this objective of keeping airplanes from hitting each other. But we were missing some pieces. We didn't know where the airplanes were other than maybe some reporting points. And so this procedural separation technique developed. Of course, it's still used in many places around the world. But you estimate the current position based on what the plan was that the airplane was going to fly, what time it took off, where it were last reported, and so forth. And you extrapolate into the future where it might be. And that keeps everybody apart. Of course, with the introduction of the World War II radar technology, the air traffic controllers could fix the position of the airplane. Now we're replacing radar with ADS-B. ADS-B, like radar, tells you where the airplane not really is, but where it used to be. It's much more recent. ADS-B is telling us where it was a few seconds ago. Radar may be as long as 30 to 60 seconds ago. But from that information, we're still having to project where we think it will be in the future. And so what NextGen, in a nutshell, is about is moving to a future where we see the trajectories. What is the intent? The Europeans call this the reference business trajectory. What is the flight plan from the time the airplane takes off throughout the flight, and it's updated through a downlink of the airplane's trajectory to the ground automation. The automation and the ground are harmonizing these pictures. And so you get very precise ability to understand what conflicts there might be at some point in the future, rather than the tactical type of environment we have today where controllers are vectoring airplanes and on a tactical basis keeping airplanes from coming together. So in order to have this future reality happen, it requires a lot. And I'm just going to open up a set of notes here so I can keep track of where we're going. So we have to do some things on the ground. We have to do some things on the airplane, and a lot of those activities are underway. But before I get too far ahead, let me just talk a little bit about current flight operations. We look at an airplane as it comes off the ground. There's some tactical activity, usually in headings, climb to an altitude, direct to some fix, getting the airplane out of the terminal environment up to the cruise altitude. And by and large, the cruise altitude, the cruise portion of the flight is pretty predictable, but there's still some opportunities for vectors from time to time. Maybe people are still going to fixes and not in a perfect great circle route. And then in the descent, again, a lot of variance, a lot of uncertainty. Top of descent begins maybe sometimes as far as 400 miles away. If you're flying back on the East Coast, you're back in places where the traffic is pretty congested. If you're not going to one of the major hub airports, you're shoved down to low altitudes, dodging other airplanes, getting vectored all around, burning a lot of fuel, a lot of uncertainty exactly when the airplane is going to be on the ground because the trajectory is not defined. It's all a very tactical scene being worked out in real time. And so if you're flying between 2 points regularly, you'll see quite a distribution in time. And so with this future that we're talking about, we have the opportunity of having the airplane leave the departure airport, fly a defined trajectory. These are often defined as performance-based navigation departure procedures. Defined trajectory to get the airplane pointed in the direction you want to go as quick as you can, cruise altitude as quick as you can, and then fly some optimum en route segment, precise top of descent, begin the idle path, ideally gliding descent, uninterrupted descent down to the runway. And the work that's being done and the requirements that are in place in NextGen, oh, thank you. See if I can keep from blinding people. Thank you, Joe. So the work that's being done is to a set of requirements that says we can do all of that and predict what time the wheels will be on the ground at the destination, plus or minus 10 seconds. We're going to hit time targets with a 10-second accuracy. That's in the statement of work. It's in the operational requirements in CESAR, which is the European version of NextGen, and the U.S. is working at the same goal as well. It's a long ways out there, but I want to provide this high level, what all this means as we're working the individual programs. Of course, we think of ADSB, we think of Datacom, we think of RMP or RNAV, LPV, all these things. They don't really mean a lot unless we have, I think, that larger understanding of what it is that the final objective is. Okay, so again, just kind of a high-level conceptual view, but this is airplanes moving between, let's say, these different airports. I've picked major hubs. Forgive me, I know many of you fly into other airports besides these major hubs. But there's work underway right now on the FAA side, and the FAA is the operator of the airspace. They're like operators of airplanes. They've got responsibilities to equip themselves, to put infrastructure in place, to provide the right level of service to their customers. So the work that the FAA is doing is providing structure in the terminal environments. We see it, as I mentioned earlier, RNAV departures, and we see it on RNAV arrivals of these optimum profile descents. That structure takes us out to some point where we no longer want that structure, particularly on long segments. And I've shown here how pressure patterns will influence the particular track we want to fly on these long segments. We'll fly routes sometimes that are much longer than the great circle distance between 2 points because of favorable tailwinds or less onerous headwinds. And then we'll connect into the terminal environment to this structure again and fly this very structured route back down to the runway. Okay, so without too much more high level, let's just talk practical. This is a set of airplane tracks into Kelowna, British Columbia. Kelowna is very popular. It's in the Okanagan Valley, just north of Spokane, up in British Columbia. Very popular destination. Maybe many of you have been there. But when you don't have that structure in place in the terminal environment, you have a lot of variance. This happens to be airplanes transitioning from Edmonton to the north, Calgary out to the east, which is to the right of the picture, and Vancouver area over here to the left. And pilots are transitioning on pilot nav, on visual days, but they may be taking a radar vector to join some route to either the ILS or the localizer, actually is all they had, to the south runway, and they had a circling maneuver to the north runway. That all was replaced beginning in 2004. There's about 100 and some airplanes flying in this particular picture. This is another picture that shows what the same operations look like after that structure is put in place. Once structure's in place, these RNAV to RMP arrivals, you have now a defined trajectory, and with the defined trajectory, now you can solve the equation for time. So now we can begin to run on these timed 4D operations, but it takes the structure. It's like the train tracks. You can't get the trains coming in and out of the station precisely on time without the tracks that are fixed. I think there's about 116 airplanes that have flown those tracks, but they look like just single airplane operations. Okay, so that's British Columbia. It's one thing to do out in British Columbia with a handful of airplanes arrive in an hour. It's another thing to do it in a place like the San Francisco Bay. So this is a picture I took one time off of a wall chart in Bay Tracon, which used to be located over near Hayward. I think it was on the Hayward Airport there. And it was a training chart that the controllers used to become familiar with how traffic flows, and they got the east flows and west flows. But it's also a picture of this future where you have these defined tracks and airplanes being coordinated in and out. That's all being done tactically today with controllers, but as that infrastructure is put in place, those will become essentially the highways in the sky. So let's talk a little bit of practical pieces now. We're going to transition from the high-level contextual to more specifics, things that maybe resonate a little bit more when you expect to have a talk on avionics. This is an inventory put together by MITRE. MITRE, of course, does a lot of research for the FAA. And they've grouped things in the major subcategories of the technologies that are necessary to support NextGen. Navigation, which is all of these pieces here. Surveillance, which is now ADS-B. And Datacom, and then there's some other things down here, electronic flight bag and HUD, ILS, and electronic flight vision systems. But we'll talk a little bit more specifically about each of these groups now, navigation, surveillance, and Datacom. This happens to be an inventory of Part 121 airplanes, the air transport airplanes. And I think it's interesting. I want to show it to you because there is, in many ways, two different communities. There's the air transport community and there's the MBAA community, the business aircraft community. For instance, in the 121 world, LPV, less than 1% of the airplanes that are being flown in 121 operations have an LPV capability. There's a few that have Datacom, more are increasing. ADS-B out, we're going to talk about that in a minute, but only 5% of the airplanes. This is a relatively recent chart. This is sometime earlier here this year. But about 5% of the airplanes currently are capable of meeting the mandate, January 1, 2020, the ADS-B out rule. So there's a lot of work underway. There's a lot of decisions being made, investments being made, equipment being built, delivered, certified. But it's all around these three areas, some sort of navigation capability, the surveillance requirement, which is not an option, it's a rule. If you're going to fly in controlled airspace after January 1, 2020, you have to have it. And then the Datacom, which is increasingly more interesting. I want to share a little bit more about that with you. So ADS-B is a program, obviously, is getting a lot of attention. I'll explain why I think it is. Certainly, it's a major investment. There's billions of dollars ultimately being committed to this capability. We're going to get some increased performance out of our airspace from ADS-B. Not a lot. It's more of an infrastructure, kind of a foundational technology. But we'll support where we want to go, where we're looking to the future with 4D. The entire infrastructure with all of the radios were complete in March of 2014. So by the time the rule is effective in early 2020, this network of radio beacons, there's about 600 or 700 of these across the country, would have been in place for almost 6 years. And this has gotten a lot of attention from the GAO, the people that look how the FAA, how the government spends money, how are they managing programs. And they're asking questions, how did these billions get spent so far in advance? You've got this entire infrastructure in place, and we don't yet see any benefit from it. So the FAA, if you've been to any conference where you've heard FAA speakers, they are singularly focused on ADS-B out. The date is January 1, 2020. I was at a conference yesterday in D.C. Multiple of the operators were there saying, as well as the FAA, that date will not change. And if you expect to fly your airplane after January 1, 2020, you definitely want to be compliant, because they're under a lot of pressure as an agency. They've made major commitments, infrastructure commitments, major expenses expended, capital expended. They've still got work to do on their side. All of the en route facilities, 24 out of 24 of the AR, or actually the en route control facilities, have the capability to ingest ADS-B in traffic and show them on the controller screens. Only 75 of the 155 have that, and only 35 of the 44 surface facilities are able to use the information. But all of that will be complete by 2019. So by 2019, they're going to have all of their pieces done. Shortly after that, the rule is effective, and all of the pieces come together quite nicely. Now, just a little bit more about the work that needs to be done. I went into the MBAA, one of their annual reports. The last year that I can find data is about, in 2013, there's just over 21,000 airplanes that are in the turboprop and business jet category in this country that are currently in operation. The forecast for 2016 was on the order of 22,000, let's call it 600 or 700. The FAA is tracking right now very closely how the equipage is coming, how it's progressing on airplanes that are operating in the airspace. They can, because of the unique information that's being projected or transmitted by each airplane, they can track right down to the tail number, so they know all of the details about the type, the model, and so forth. But in this particular chart, they've just grouped it all as general aviation. There's 21,341 airplanes that were equipped as of December 10th of 2015. They're tracking this every month. I work on committees back in D.C., and I get regularly some updates on this. But it's not progressing at the rate it should progress. This one line here is assuming that by 2020, 100,000 airplanes in the general aviation market have to be equipped. The green line is 160,000 by 2020. And there may be still a little bit of divergence in the slope, but the slope is slowly increasing or matching at least the 100,000 goal. They're not very far from what they describe as the danger zone, which is where there's no ability to recover. They're going to be too far behind, and they won't have either the equipment, the certification support, the MRO facilities to get airplanes equipped in time. I think it's around 600 airplanes a month at the present run rate to get to that goal. There's a lot. I'm sure many of you are dealing with this. The interesting thing about this 21,341, that's all GA airplanes. I drilled into the data from the FAA because we at Sandel are targeting this market. We have a new cockpit system that is in final phase of development, and this is our target market for this solution. There's a small percentage of that are the turboprop and business jet airplanes. So there's less than 15% of that 22,700 number of turboprops and jet airplanes that have been modified to date or shown to be compliant with the ADS-B out rule. So that means over 85% of the airplanes have to have some work done between now and January of 2020. Okay, so moving on now from surveillance to performance-based navigation. The FAA has spent a lot of money. Certainly we're flying GPS approaches, Lpv approaches, RNAV approaches to many of the airports that you fly to, maybe most or all. There's data. This is off of a web. This actually is a presentation, but you can go on a website that the FAA puts up, and you can track and see how they're progressing and so forth. But there's a lot of that, what I described earlier, is infrastructure or structure in the terminal area that's being built out by the FAA. One thing that this community is not participating in right now, when I say this community, unless you're flying a G650 or a Falcon with the Honeywell Epic cockpits, you're likely not an RMP AR operator. And I didn't point that out on the 121 list, but there's a fairly high percentage of RMP AR capability on the airline side. So where business has invested in LPV, the airline community invested in RMP AR. And so we've got some interest in bringing these two capabilities into the same cockpit, and I'll mention a little bit later why that's important. Actually, I'm going to mention it now. So this is a Lpv approach into Helena, Montana. Before I say much more, let me just go back here and say there's 384 RMP AR procedures that are in place around the country. There's several hundred around the world. If you fly into some places, maybe like Queenstown or Machu Picchu, Cusco Airport, there's the in and out for those procedures are exclusively RMP AR. This is a chart I just pulled off of Helena. It happens to be one of the places where the RMP AR procedures are deployed by the FAA. And I want to just make a point here. This is LPV. The decision altitude on the LPV approach is 1,100 feet to runway 27. And the reason it's not a 200-foot DA is there's a lot of subtleties in instrument procedure design. You know, the obstacle clearance surfaces and where the obstacles are and what do you have as far as guidance to work around those obstacles? What are the rules in this procedure support? If we look at the RMP AR procedure, we see, first of all, things that may not be familiar to you, a number here in the decision altitude blocks that has a 0.18, 0.22, 0.3. Those are levels of performance requirements that the procedure is saying that the avionics have to deliver in order to fly down to that level. And so the highest performance for this particular procedure is 0.18, and it delivers a DA of 267 feet. So if you're an operator who's based at Helena, or you go to Helena a lot, and you're landing on runway 27 in these low weather events, RMP AR is a capability that you might be interested in having. But as I said, this community, business jet and turboprop community, has really mostly been locked outside of that just by virtue of the fact that the avionics don't provide the performance. Okay, so just looking at navigation in a broader sense just for a minute, there's applications for these procedures, obviously, in places where we don't have ILSs. We see a lot of LPV giving us ILS-level performance to runways and good performance, equivalent minimums to ILS minimums of 200 feet above touchdown. We have other procedures that give us performance, like I showed you in Helena, where there's obstacles, terrain obstacles that would limit the LPV, so it gives you a lower minimum. RMP and RNAV are providing other benefits that are quite attractive in congested airspace. The difficulty with that is when you start loading a runway and you constrain an airplane to a particular path, the immediate problem that develops for the controller is how do I coordinate airplanes, particularly when they're coming from different paths and merging fairly close to the runway. We've essentially tied the controller's hands when we ask them to clear airplanes to fly these procedures. We've tied their hands by not allowing them to have the only means that they've ever had to get the spacing right on airplanes, which is mostly vectors. Sometimes speed controls, but the best way for them to get airplanes lined up is by vectoring and getting the paths stretched and shortened so they can get the right spacing of airplanes. When you're talking about a number of airplanes going to a single runway, this is important. If it's only 1 or 2 airplanes an hour, it doesn't matter. Likely they're going to be deconflicted. So as part of their responsibility as the airspace operator, the FAA is developing a number of tools, and you may see them from time to time. We just got a bulletin, for instance, over the last couple, 3 weeks that told us that the FAA would now be giving us, controllers would now be giving us speed commands that are in 5-knot increments. We've always done that in 10-knot increments. Well, the 5-knot increment adds a little extra performance, and the reason why that bulletin came out is because the FAA is deploying something called ground interval management spacing. So there's ground pieces and there's airborne pieces that are all part of this timing scheme to move from a 3D operation to a 4D operation where we have time of arrival control. So ground interval management, or GIMS, has been deployed in the Albuquerque terminal area, it's been deployed in Denver, and it's been deployed in Seattle, and there's about 7 or 8 other airports over the next couple of years where this will happen. And you will start getting time advisories, speed advisories that are much further out than we've ever seen them before. As far as 550 nautical miles from the airports, you may start to be given speed commands, all for the purpose of getting everybody coordinated for not just necessarily the line you're in, but how airplanes will be coming together at some merge point that's down the road a bit. There's another tool that's going to be deployed in 2019 called TSAS, and this comprises, for the moment, for the foreseeable future, the next decade, the entire complement of the FAA's efforts on the ground side to get airplane flow coordinated so we can take full advantage of these fixed arrival and departure structures. But there's things on the airplane. So there's an FMS lateral offset. This allows the airplanes to sidestep and basically take an off-ramp while other airplanes go by, or you overtake other airplanes, and so you'll have instructions from the ground to offset by some amount. But time of arrival control, some airplanes call this RTA. If you're flying a Rockwell-Collins system, they have, and the committee that I work on, we have Rockwell on there, they advise us that their FMSs have the code on board that would give the airplane the ability to fly to a certain point at a given time. It's maybe not enabled, but it's relatively simple enabled, and it's part of the embedded code. What the price is, I don't know, but it's there, which is a big advantage that can be used for the future. And then there's something called interval management en route and terminal. And this is the idea that you'll be taking not ADS-B out information and send it to the ground. The airplane will be receiving ADS-B information from other airplanes, put it on what's called a cockpit display of traffic information, a CDTI, and it's beginning to work out the merging of other airplanes at a designated point that the controller has given these airplanes to merge. And then you would station keep with a fixed time or distance behind airplanes, and so self-organize using the onboard equipment. The investment decisions for the FAA to have all of that capability isn't until 2019, and the earliest we'd see that is in the mid-20s, actually being used on board the airplanes. But there's a number of companies that are producing either avionics capability or Class 3 EFB type devices or tablets that would have the capability to provide this information and get the utility that the FAA is planning. Okay, so just back to this idea of having procedures provide benefits in terminal areas. This is just a quick screenshot I took from a presentation we had last week from a group that has been commissioned by the FAA to study benefits. It's called the Joint Analysis Team. They're going to be delivering their report to the FAA in October. This is a little bit of a preview of what Congress ultimately will hear through the NextGen Advisory Committee. But it's a record of what's happening in Denver, where they have parallel operations at the Denver International Airport. Parallel operations are separated, airplanes are separated either 1,000 feet or 3 miles horizontally. That's the minimum separation standard that we have, unless you're on a localizer. So once the airplanes capture the localizer, then you're separated horizontally sufficiently, even though you may be less than 3 miles, and so the altitudes can come back and be converging as you capture glide slopes and fly down. So what you see in here are airplanes being vectored to the 2 ILSs, to the outboard runways, and the distances they're brought on is all part of this variance we see with the controllers having to work in a tactical environment. Those procedures were replaced a number of years ago with RMP-AR procedures that take the airplane from the downwinds and bring the airplane much closer in to the runway. And the thing that's really important here, and it's a little bit subtle, but I want to see if I can make the point that you'll catch what's going on. The separation standard for parallel approaches required the use of a localizer. In the course of the last 5 years, the FAA developed a new separation standard that said just by virtue of being established on an RMP procedure, which is an aircraft-defined, aircraft-positioned route, just by virtue of being established on that procedure, you have sufficient separation insurance that you can now fly co-altitude as you converge on these parallel approaches. And what that means is instead of having these finals run out 20 and 25 miles, you can pull these finals in very close to the airport. And so you're seeing here with tens of thousands of approaches being flown, you're seeing some pretty significant noise benefits to the community. That's one of the main objectives of the airport, but the airlines and the operators like it for the fuel and time savings. Okay, so just to turn the corner now, let's talk about datacom. So we talked first about surveillance, we talked about performance-based navigation, and now datacom. Datacom in our industry has been going through a little bit of a transformation. It's really interesting. Datacom, as we've seen it, for the most part in our industry, it was for oceanic applications for fans-equipped airplanes. So when you're going, initially started in the Pacific in the mid-90s. Boeing pioneered this with some Pacific Rim operators. It was a combination of an ADS-C, where the airplane forms a contract with or establishes a contract with the control authority to transmit ADS information at agreed intervals, 10, 15 minutes, whatever it is. There's the RMP piece, the navigation piece, which required satellite positioning. But there was this datacom piece that provided the communication between the controller and the pilot, and that controller-pilot data link communication, that CPDLC, all that message set, all that linkage was designed originally for oceanic operations. It moved into the North Atlantic, and what's really interesting for maybe most of us now is that, those of us that don't fly oceanic, is that a number of years ago, Canada implemented CPDLC operations, and so simple frequency changes and things that you would normally do through the microphone, you're doing now if you have the fans or the CPDLC datacom, you can do that in Canadian airspace. Now, not to be outdone, the FAA has been a little bit behind, but is catching up rapidly. If you've been out flying at many of the airports recently, in the last 6 months, you might have seen on the ATIS that CPDLC departure clearances are available if that particular facility has had that capability enabled. So this DCL program is now spread to, it's about 90 airports across our country, and there'll be many, many more. The infrastructure is being put in at a pretty impressive clip into these towers. And in response to that, airplanes are able to use that, get that digital clearance. And that's kind of neat because it keeps you off the frequency calling for the clearance. But what's particularly neat is the airplane and the control center stay linked up while you're taxiing out. If there's a flow program, if you're in Newark or Teterboro, one of these places where thunderstorms in the summertime are always changing your departure routes because the gates get closed down by thunderstorms and so forth. So rather than being a line of 100 airplanes trying to get a clearance on the radio, they just shove it to you now through the CPDLC link. So there's some advantages on this ground piece that people have been taking advantage of, and there's many business operators, business jet operators that are participating, and of course a lot of airlines as well. 11,000 flights a week as of August of 16 are using datacom in U.S. airspace. Now, if we look at what the FAA's plans are for datacom, it gets even more interesting. So we're starting, as I said, right now with departure clearances. So CPDLC departure clearances started late last year, and it's going to run through the 2030s. Initial en route services come online in 2019, and with en route services in the U.S., it'll be much like Canada, but expanded. We'll be getting transfer communication, these frequency changes, initial check-in, altimeter settings, altitudes, some limited speeds, some limited crossing restrictions, airborne reroutes. So again, a flow program, some sort of campaign starts while you're en route. They can uplink to the airplane a new route very efficiently, and you can accept it and also have some direct-to capability. And then out in the mid-20s, there's a more complete set that comes online. Now, all of this is being done through fans, defined equipment, either operating through satellite, Iridium, or operating through VHF datacom, the ACARS radios, VDL mode 0 or VHF data link mode 2 is the latest. If you're putting new radios in, you're probably doing VDL mode 2 because it has a lot more bandwidth. All right, so that's just a quick review, and we've got some time here for more discussions. But I'll leave you with this, is that as you're making decisions about your fleet, yes, we have a mandate for ADS-B out. We have obsolescence issues with a lot of our displays and different things on the airplane. To the extent that you're able, and to the extent that whoever your supplier is that you're working with on your airplanes, try to look at this future of where we're going with some of these elements that I've brought to your attention in mind, understanding that we're working towards this future of having less variance in the airspace, more defined 4D trajectory-based operations, and it takes a number of technologies in these three domains, this navigation, surveillance, and datacom, to make it all work together. We're happy at Sandel to be doing what we're doing, which is building an entire clean sheet, ground-up platform that is built to work in this environment. It's not going to do all of this as it comes out, but it'll do what needs to be done, what capabilities need to be there today, with the provisions, the hooks in place to support as these other things become more defined in time. Okay, so I'll leave this here for now, and happy to take questions. I think we've got just a few minutes. Al said you're going to be on at 55, is that right? Okay, so we've got 9 minutes by the original estimate I think we had. So if we have questions, I'm happy to chat. Otherwise, we can talk at a break. I'm here through the rest of the afternoon. All right, Al. I think,
Good. Thank you, Steve.